just start working now, otherwise we won't have time. We're going to be out of oil within a few years.
In the 70s, Marion King Hubbard, the original prophet of peak oil, in late 1949, he did the math that said U.S. domestic oil production will peak in 1970. So that's not some feat of Nostradamus communicating with some entity. It's math, it's science, it's simple. But in the 70s, M. King Hubbard testified before Congress. That was 1974. In 1976, President Jimmy Carter said, man, we cannot use as much energy as we have been using.
To use energy more efficiently.
That's when solar panels went up. That's when he started. He knew. They have known in Washington. I have declassified CIA documents from 1976 showing that CIA was perfectly aware of peak oil. All plastic is oil. Most paints, all pesticides are made from oil. Everything from toothpaste to toothbrushes is made from oil. There are 7 gallons of oil in every tire. There is nothing anywhere in any combination that will replace the edifice built by fossil fuels. Nothing. Well, peak oil is probably now very easy to explain, much easier than it was a long time ago. People have felt what $147 a barrel oil feels like. Essentially, peak oil is like, if you know what a bell curve is, goes up, comes down. Peak oil is the point in oil production when you're at the top of the bell curve. And essentially what that means is you've used up half of the resource. But in the case of oil or any other substance like that, no matter how much money you throw at it, you're never going to be able to increase oil production above where it was at peak. As of 2008, the International Energy Agency has admitted that there is a global 9% decline rate in oil production. That's the equivalent of about 8 million barrels a day. There is no way, having plucked all the low-hanging fruit and found the big reservoirs, that we're going to be able to offset a 9% decline rate. First of all, if you think there might be oil someplace, then what you do is you go drill a test well. Then what you have to do is to take that one well in the center and then you drill a series of appraisal wells around that well to determine where the oil field might go. You don't know how much oil you're going to get, how deep it is, what kind of oil it's going to be. There are many different grades of oils, a lot of which are more expensive to refine. So all of that has to do with how long it takes to make something produce. How much energy do you get back for how much energy you invested? When oil was seeping out of the ground in Pennsylvania, you got a return of, 200 to 1. When you have to go offshore to deep water, drilling in 15,000 feet of water, and your first well costs $150 million to build, all that's energy that's being invested to get energy. And the moment you start burning more energy to get a barrel of oil out of the ground, then it's worth it. Forget about it.
Americans were on the way to owning millions of cars.
Of democracy, people in this land of
800 million internal combustion powered vehicles on the planet. They all run on oil. It takes uncounted barrels of oil to make those cars and engines in the first place. And you cannot plug any new technology into an internal combustion powered engine. With 7 gallons of oil in every tire, nobody will ever make 800 million new internal combustion anything because there ain't going to be enough oil. The soil is the place from which all plant matter gets its nutrients. And if you keep sucking the nutrients out, the soil is useless. For all of history, the way the soil was replenished and the nutrients were returned in some measure to the soil was that plant matter was allowed to decay, to compost, to restock the soil. That's why crop rotation is so important. You may have one crop of celery which will suck certain chemicals out of the soil. Another crop, wheat or something else, may return those same chemicals to the soil. So the soil maintains a balance. It's kind of sad because we as a species have become so disconnected from the earth. We don't have any real contact with the earth. We don't have any sense of its functions, its feel, its nature, its seasons, its timing. First of all, the topsoil on which food is grown now is nothing more than a sponge onto which we pour chemicals that we get from oil and natural gas. And without those chemicals, the soil has been turned into a junkie. The soil is worthless. So when you plant a crop now, what happens is you drive an oil-powered machine, drives along, and it plows. Then you drive another oil-powered machine, and it drives along, and it plants. So you have ammonium nitrate fertilizers that are then sprayed on by another oil-powered vehicle. Then the crop dusters come along that are powered by oil that spray pesticides that are all made from petroleum. Then when it's time to harvest the food, what do? You drive another oil-powered machine and you harvest it. You use another oil-powered machine to drive it to a place where it's processed. Then you wrap it up in plastic, which is oil, and you put it in another oil-powered machine and you drive it X number of miles to a food distribution warehouse, an oil-powered machine to your supermarket.
August 2nd, 1990. Saddam Hussein's forces crashed through the defenses of oil-rich Kuwait. In fear of an Iraqi invasion into Saudi Arabia, the United States and her coalition allies poured into the Arabian Peninsula to form a deterrent that would be known as Desert Shield. The result was a series of diplomatic talks, negotiations and counter-negotiations that rapidly declined into a no-hope situation. On August the 17th, 1991, Desert Shield became Desert Storm. The conflict was witnessed by millions through the eye of CNN and the BBC, showing propaganda of the systematic eradication of Saddam's forces by a coalition far superior in technological, political, and economic power. However, what was little known was that from the outset the war was engineered, controlled, and manipulated by an elite group. A group which had created the illusion of a man with power, at the head of a million-strong army, on the verge of going nuclear. A man who had gained control over 1/5 of the world's oil overnight. However, in reality, he was merely a pawn, in amongst many pawns, just a puppet in a grand master plan, with the Gulf War as a well-orchestrated stepping stone. The orchestrators of the war were by no means strangers to controlling major world events. In fact, they have done so for centuries.
Get control of that oil. Because Saddam Hussein had been talking about pricing his oil in euros, taking it away from the dollar. We got in there, we restructured everything, we put in a friendly government using the US dollar, and we assured the oil companies their quote-unquote fair access and fair share of Iraqi oil.
The international oil companies into Iraqi oil fields.
We have no intention of leaving Iraq. We're never going to leave Iraq. Going back to 2004, we started building the largest, most permanent military bases, 3 of them in the world, plus the largest embassy compound that's ever been built. We built an embassy compound in Baghdad that's bigger than Vatican City. That's not a temporary deal. Nobody's going to take that oil, but we are sitting on it. But there is not enough oil in Iraq to change anything. But Iraq probably has around 90 billion barrels of recoverable oil. That sounds like a lot of oil. But when you consider that in 2008, the world was consuming 85 million barrels a day, that means 1 billion barrels of oil only lasts for about 11 and a half days, so that ain't that much.
It's only the first of the good things that will come to Iraq, thanks to oil.
As a matter of fact, no field the size of Ghawar, the largest field in Saudi Arabia, has ever been discovered since. Saudi Arabia has 25% of the known oil reserves on the planet. 25%. Why, if Saudi Arabia has all these untapped reserves onshore, are they moving heavily into offshore drilling? Now, if it's 5, 10, 50 times more expensive to drill offshore than on land, doesn't that tell you that Saudi Arabia knows they've got no more oil to find? It's axiomatic that if Saudi Arabia has passed its peak and is in decline, the whole planet is, just because of the size of the reserves that are there. Actual reserve estimates are state secrets. The Saudis don't dare announce that they've passed their peak of oil production. Why? They have a very restive population that have been sold an expectation of a rising standard of living, and the moment Saudi Arabia acknowledges its past peak, it may well have a revolution. Now, what happens if there's a revolution in Saudi Arabia with 25% of the world's known oil? Where's that oil going to get replaced from? It can't be.
The deal was struck 60 years ago.
America struck a pact with Saudi Arabia. You give us oil, and we will give you protection.
Every president since has reaffirmed the arrangement. Over the years, both sides have benefited. Billions of petrodollars were recycled to buy expensive American military hardware. When necessary, America has intervened directly to keep the kingdom safe.
They found the oil for us, and they've been our friends ever since.
But there's always been another Saudi Arabia. One of fervent Muslim warriors, tribesmen with an innate distrust of outsiders. For them, the monarchy is corrupt, and the deal with America a bargain with the devil. Saudi preachers ascend their pulpits to rail against infidels and Jews. Saudi citizens have supplied millions of dollars to school and train jihadis around the world.
When it became clear that 15 of the 19 were Saudis, that was a disaster.
Now, Saudi militants have turned their sights on targets inside the kingdom and on Americans in Iraq. President Bush maintains that the Saudis are America's friends. Tonight, a special frontline history, House of Saud, the story of a troubled alliance. At the Al Yamama Palace in Riyadh, Saudi officials gather for a royal majlis. It's largely ceremonial, but speaks volumes about how this country is governed. It is presided over by the kingdom's de facto ruler, Crown Prince Abdullah bin Abdulaziz, a son of the kingdom's founder. To one side of the Crown Prince sit leading Wahhabi clerics, guardians of tradition who habitually resist change. On the Crown Prince's other side are the royal family and its retainers. Presumably, the two groups are partners in power. This is a nation in shock, where tradition and modernity are in violent collision. Few places on earth have come so far, so fast, as Saudi Arabia in the 20th century.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, La ilaha
illallah. 100 years ago, the Arabian Peninsula was a place of warring tribes. Nomads, sheikhs, emirs. Among them was the family of Al Saud.
At that time, the Saudi Arabian kingdom consisted of tribes and small fiefdoms. There was no unity amongst these warring groups. The Saudi Arabian kingdom was never united the way it is today, until the reign of King Abdulaziz.
1902, with just 60 men at his side, Abdulaziz ibn Saud rode out to begin his quest for a kingdom.
He certainly had a vision. He had a large, big vision of what he wanted this country to be. He wanted it to be a nation and to take its place among the nations, rather than to be a forgotten backwater where nobody cares what they live or die, what's happening there, but to be a player in the international scene.
But to conquer the whole Arabian Peninsula, he needed the fighting skills of the nomadic Bedouins known as the Ikhwan. The Ikhwan, or Muslim Brothers, were renowned warriors, light and mobile and extremely courageous. They were also fervent Wahhabi Islamic Puritans. To recruit them, Abdulaziz had to commit the family to spreading their fundamentalist version of Islam.
The Ikhwan were an important fighting force that supported the expansion of Ibn Saud. They had this vision that they propagated true Islam in its purest form. So anything they encountered that differed from that vision was regarded as objectionable.
The nature of where they were coming from, the desert, was isolated really for almost 800 years. In the desert you have either day or night, you have cold or hot. You don't have these shades. Even the music is only one string. And that has kind of polarized the way of thinking. It's either black or white. It's either you're with me or against me.
The first Western reference we have to the Ikhwan, the Brotherhood, comes from Captain Shakespeare, who was one of the early British explorers in Arabia. And he'd already heard that these people were fiercely anti-Western. Right from the beginning, this cutting edge of Saudi power was mistrustful of the West, and lethally mistrustful. For them to kill a foreigner might well guarantee their place in heaven.
With the Ikhwan troops, Abdulaziz captured province after province of the vast desert. By 1926, he and the Ikhwan had captured the jewels of Arabia, Mecca and Medina, making Abdulaziz the ruler of Islam's holy shrines. It brought prestige and substantial income from visiting pilgrims. It was also a great victory for the Wahhabis. The Wahhabis took their name from an 18th century Islamic preacher, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. Wahhab was first to see the value in forging an alliance with the able tribesmen of the Al Saud family in order to help spread his austere version of Islam. The Ikhwan were living out Wahhab's dream, and they wanted to keep going.
They wanted more, and they just wanted to go on and attack particularly the British settlements in the north and Transjordan and so on.
They wanted to create an empire extending across all of the Muslim Ummah. They would have, God knows where they would have stopped, maybe in France, given the chance.
So when Ibn Saud tried to restrain them and ask them not to launch attacks into these territories, they rebelled.
They revolted against him, and they accused him of being an infidel, of having abandoned the faith of Islam and becoming worldly and all that kind of thing.
They said, why Ibn Saud sent his kids or children or sons abroad to London this is against Islam. Why we had the new technology coming, wireless station, whatever, this is against Islam.
If Abdulaziz were to stay in power, he had to destroy the Ikhwan. But how could he, the defender of Islam, justify going to war against his Muslim fighters? His way out was to win over the religious establishment, the ulama, who were regarded as the moral guardians of the realm.
He turned to the religious establishment in Riyadh. He said, "You judge this. Judge between me and the Ikhwan." So they looked into the Islamic laws. They scrutinized the Holy Quran and the Hadith, and found that King Abdulaziz was right. So they gave the famous fatwa, which said that the Ikhwan were wrong. They had no right under Islamic law to rebel against the ruler.
So from that moment, they actually changed their role, the ulama, and they became almost like a force to be used to sanction politics. And that was the crucial moment in 1927.
With the ulama's consent, Abdulaziz crushed the Ikhwan. The path was now clear. In 1932, Abdulaziz declared himself a king and, for good measure, gave his name to the country, Saudi Arabia. To unite the kingdom, King Abdulaziz married a daughter of every tribal chief in his realm and produced 45 legitimate sons. Every Saudi king since has been a son of Abdulaziz. How many daughters he produced is unknown. They are not counted. Abdulaziz would not forget that religion and the ulama remained central to his rise to power. He became the kingdom's chief defender of the faith.
فإذا كنا نريد اجتماع كلمتنا وتوحيد شؤوننا وحفظ جامعتنا فليس لنا جامعة نجتمع عليها إلا جامعة الكتاب والسنة.
But Saudi Arabia would have remained an insignificant backwater in world affairs if it were not for the discovery of oil. King Abdulaziz was aware that neighboring states like Iraq and Bahrain had great natural resources, but most experts did not believe that the fields extended to Saudi Arabia. Then, in 1931, they were surprised.
There was an American philanthropist called Mr. Crane. Mr. Crane actually came to Saudi Arabia, and he saw King Abdulaziz. And King Abdulaziz was complaining about the lack of availability of water in the country.
Mr. Crane sponsored a geological survey.
He wasn't looking for oil. So it is by chance that we discovered oil. We were looking for water. And this feat happens until today. Every time we look for water, we find oil.
But the only way to get it out of the ground was to invite foreign companies into the kingdom. And Abdulaziz feared that inviting foreigners, or infidels, would be resisted by the religious establishment. He invited them anyway.
The king asked the companies to come. One of the scholars challenged that. He said the King of Saud is doing something against Islam. So the king knew about this, and he asked the scholars to come to his court. When he came, he said, I want you to give me an example why I shall not do that. He said, this is against Islam. He said, prove to me. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ used Jews, used Christians. He did not say, these are non-Muslim, I cannot be in touch with them, I cannot utilize them. Didn't the Prophet use them? The scholar said, yes. He said, I'm doing that the same.
In 1933, the first foreign oil prospectors started arriving in the kingdom. King Abdulaziz did not care who got the concession, as long as they paid the money up front. The British showed interest, but it was the Americans who paid $170,000 in gold for a concession that would turn out to contain the biggest oil fields on Earth.
The first number of holes was dry, and the question was, why should we continue with this? They had been ordered to stop, and they'd failed to read their mail or whatever, and so they did strike the oil, and that well is today operating.
The Arabian American Oil Company, or Aramco, was created to prospect for oil and market it. America's 4 largest oil corporations became the sole shareholders.
When King Abdulaziz went to open the first oil field and he smelled the sulfur, and he was repugnantly surprised by the smell, and they told him, "But Your Majesty, this is what oil, the sulfur of oil smells like." So, let me smell more of it.
The king still had little idea what riches Saudi oil would soon bring. But by 1945, the U.S. urgently needed oil facilities to help supply its forces fighting around the globe. For President Franklin Roosevelt, oil was an American national security priority. From Yalta, FDR sent a message to the Saudi monarch.
The contacts were made, but the decision was kept secret until after he left. The Minister of Finance, Abdullah Suleiman, came to the king's wives and said, "Abdulaziz sends his greetings. I am at sea, on my way to meet Roosevelt. We'll be back in 2 or 3 days."
Any royal trip like this has to be big. And it's not just for a show. No. It's like, unifying all portions of the society with you together. So he had his own advisors. He has some of his own sons, princes. He had some of his tribal chieftains at that time. So it's like a small state moving outside its own state to meet Roosevelt, and it has to be, from all portions of society.
It was a very interesting meeting. Here's Roosevelt in his wheelchair, and as you know, he's not a big man, and he's in a wheelchair, and he's on the deck of the Quincy. And King Abdulaziz, who's about 6'3" and 6'4", big, stricken with trachoma, not seeing too good, but walking with a cane. And these two hit it off right away. King Abdulaziz started kidding Roosevelt about, "You're lucky you're in that wheelchair. You can wheel yourself anywhere." And Roosevelt said to him, "If you like this wheelchair so good, I have an extra one here. I'll give it to you."
After exchanging gifts, they got down to business. America needed to lease an airport and Navy refueling station for its war against Japan. But it was the security of the Saudi kingdom that was at the forefront of King Abdulaziz's concerns. He requested U.S. military assistance and training, and they agreed to construct the Dhahran military base. In return, the king guaranteed that the U.S. would always have secure access to Saudi oil.
America struck a pact with Saudi Arabia. You give us oil at cheap prices, and we will give you protection. This protection eventually evolved into an American hegemony over the entire Gulf region, and the deal extended to the Gulf region, that this was an American area of influence, and in return for this, it shall be protected from all enemies.
But the king still knew he needed American protection.
The king made his views very clear, including his sense of disappointment, but his main concern at that time was encirclement. He felt that with the Hashemites in Iraq and in Jordan, that he was encircled. So the sense that there were hostile elements around the country, coveting its riches and counting upon its internal weakness, its limited ability to defend itself, hence it needed an outside protector.
Hussein ibn Ali, the Sharif of Mecca and head of the Arab nationalist movement, entered into an alliance with Britain, following a secret exchange of letters with Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner and effective ruler of Egypt.
They call themselves Hashemites. They call the family Hashemites because that's the family or the tribe of the Prophet Muhammad. They were the Bani Hashim, the sons of Hashim. So Sharif Hussein was the leader of the Hashemites. He was the person responsible for Mecca and Medina,
being a descendant of the Prophet. But Sharif Hussein was speaking of liberating Arab lands, building a new national state. He wanted to be king of the Arabs, not simply of Arabians.
Taking Britain's assurances of support at face value, Hussein, together with his sons Faisal and Abdullah, amassed a sizable force. The new army was commanded by the young and charismatic Faisal, who had captured the imagination of the Arab masses in the quest for Arab independence. Yet even as Hussein and Faisal mobilized their troops, the British were preparing to sell them short. Back in London, in the spring of 1916, Britain was negotiating with France about the future shape of the Middle East. Behind closed doors, Sir Mark Sykes of the British Foreign Office had been meeting his French opposite number, François-Georges Picot. Britain knew it was vital to offer the French a stake in the spoils of the Ottoman Empire, should they win the war. Poring over a map of the Levant, Sykes and Picot personally drew in the areas they wished to see under their control. Their secret deal amounted to the virtual carve-up of the Middle East. In Area A for the French and Area B for the British, the imperialists intended to exercise power indirectly. They would appoint advisors and take charge of the finances in their respective spheres of influence. Then there was the area coloured blue, which was to be directly controlled by France. This included what was then known as Greater Syria, where the French traditionally had commercial and religious interests. As for the area coloured pink, known as Iraq, with its strategic ports, railways and oil, this was to be under British rule. The area coloured yellow represented Palestine and was envisaged as an international zone, except for Haifa.
What the British wanted was the oil of Iraq, and they concentrated on getting Iraq and getting away from Iraq to the Mediterranean in order to transport this oil. So they got Haifa on the Palestinian coast, and they got most of Iraq.
The Sykes-Picot agreement was a pretty shameful document, and I wouldn't attempt to defend it.
The Arabs hitched their fortunes to the British. They considered themselves to be fighting with the Allies, but at the same time they were not merged into the British Army, that they continued to act as an independent army called the Northern Army.
While the Arab army advanced northwards, Britain's General Allenby had crossed the Suez Canal.
Sharif Hussein and the others said, wait a minute, what's going on? Why are you not giving us independence? And secondly, why are you dividing us up into Zone A and Zone B? And at that point, of course, the Arabs realized that not only had the British got their own particular interests, for example, in the ports of Palestine or in Iraq, but that they...
A brand new future awaited the Arabs. Unfortunately, it just wasn't the one they were fighting for. In the middle of the war, the British betrayed the Arabs with not one, but two secret agreements. In the Balfour Declaration of 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour promised Lord Rothschild laying the foundations of the future state of Israel.
Signed the Treaty of Dahrin as early as 1915, which made the lands of the Al Saud family a British protectorate. Britain did create Saudi Arabia in collaboration with the Wahhabi Al Saud tribe and did use Wahhabis' intolerance and its old policy of divide and conquer. Abdul Aziz bin Abdul Rahman Al Saud, who founded the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932, was a local ruler in the Arabian Peninsula when the Great War began. Abdul Aziz was a descendant of Muhammad Al Saud, who ruled the Najd area of the peninsula in the 18th century, who was a friend of the founder of Wahhabism, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, and who chose Wahhabism for his tribe for the first time. The British followed the treaty with a monthly tribute of £5,000, as well as huge supplies of arms, and helped the would-be king conquer the Central Arabian Peninsula, especially the cities of Hejaz, Mecca and Medina until 1927. London replaced the Treaty of Darien with the Treaty of Jeddah on May the 20th, 1927, that recognized the Saud-held territories' independence, a move that helped Abdulaziz start the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on September the 23rd, 1932. The creation of Saudi Arabia was also a victory for Britain in line with its original designs envisaged in Wahhabi Islam, whose founder was excommunicated by scholars of all other Islamic sects in the 18th century. Indeed, it was initially illegal for a Muslim to wage war on another Muslim, yet Britain needed a new interpretation of Islam that would sanction such fratricide under the guise of jihad. That led to Wahhabism.
In 1918, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The war had confirmed Churchill's point of view. Without oil, a great nation could not survive. The League of Nations agreed. It was the beginning of Part 2 of European oil imperialism. The British assigned an exceptional woman, Gertrude Bell, to fulfill the League of Nations mission to build up a sovereign state in Iraq during the time of the Mandate. An expert on the Orient out of Passion, who spoke perfect Arabic, she was present at all high-level talks, also participating in the discussions about border issues with the Saudi king Ibn Saud. His findings, which he reported to Washington only a few months later, were sensational. He predicted that in the future, the Mideast would be the center of world oil production. In his report, he also included Iran and Iraq, as well as Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar, whose resources he also analyzed. Even in his most cautious estimates, he assumed that 25 billion barrels could be found in the region, 5 billion of them in Saudi Arabia. To the British ambassador in Washington, he said,
"The Persian oil is all yours. The oil in Iraq and Kuwait we will share. As to the Saudi oil, it belongs to us."
Roosevelt made it brutally clear to the British that he would not accept their claim to Saudi Arabia. Ibn Saud's empire, at the time barely 20 years old, had emerged from a pact between the clan Saud and religion. In the 18th century, the Sauds had joined forces with the sect leader Abdul Wahhab. Ibn Saud was preparing to reconquer the Saud tribal area and the capital Riyadh, both of which had been lost in battle to the Jabal Shammah tribe neighboring to the north, and its rulers, the Al-Rashid family. Ibn Saud still had one antagonist left, the Hashemite ruler Hussein bin Ali, Mecca and Medina. In 1918, after the overthrow of the Sultan, Ibn Saud attacked. His Ikhwan troops committed such atrocious massacres that Mecca surrendered without a fight, and Medina fell after a cruel siege. The unification of the country by sword was completed. To be in control of Mecca was important for Ibn Saud. Now he could pose worldwide as the custodian of Islam, and the hundreds and thousands of pilgrims filled the treasury with money. Thus he had himself crowned King of Saudi Arabia in 1932.
Both Israel and Saudi Arabia are much more dangerous enemies to the United States than the Iranians are. The Iranians are a third-rate military power that we could handle very easily. But, you know, the Congress is crazy for war with Iran. Listen to Senator Graham and Senator McCain and Joe Lieberman. They're owned by the Israelis. The Saudis are very influential. So when you look at these kind of things, you have to ask, who would benefit from the war? The Israelis and the Saudis would love to see our money and our young men and women being killed to fight their enemies in Iran.
All right, you have engaged professionally in counterintelligence to enhance the security of the United States during much of your adult life.
When you look at the bottom line, who this benefits if it leads to military action against Iran, it only benefits the Israelis and Saudi Arabia. And there's a precedent for it. We've already fought 2 wars against Iraq in favor of Israeli interests and Saudi interests. So we're always being pushed to get our people killed for their interests. So I think it could happen another time. Why not?
What we need to stand up and say is not only did they attack the USS Liberty, they did 9/11. They did it.
It has been more than 16 years since a civilian working for the Navy was charged with passing secrets to Israel. Jonathan Pollard pled guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage and is serving a life sentence. At first, Israeli leaders claimed Pollard was part of a rogue operation, but later took responsibility for his work. Now, Fox News has learned some U.S. investigators believe that there are Israelis again very much engaged in spying in and on the U.S., who may have known things they didn't tell us before September 11th. Fox News correspondent Carl Cameron has details in the first of a four-part series.
Since September 11th, more than 60 Israelis have been arrested or detained, either under the new Patriot anti-terrorism law or for immigration violations. A handful of active Israeli military were among those detained, according to investigators, who say some of the detainees also failed polygraph questions when asked about alleged surveillance activities against and in the United States.
It was widely reported that men had been celebrating the attack after recording the first plane strike. They were not Al-Qaeda, but they were detained.
I grabbed my binoculars and I could see the towers from my window. And this is where I'm looking. And all of a sudden, down there, I see this van park. And I see 3 guys on top of the van. And I could see that they were like happy. They didn't look shocked to me. They didn't look shocked.
There was a group of Israelis, some of whom later were revealed as Mossad assets, who were arrested after cheering and high-fiving and videotaping the crash of the airplanes into the World Trade Towers.
Asked this week about another sprawling investigation and the detention of 60 Israelis since September 11th, the Bush administration treated the questions like hot potatoes.
I would just refer you to the Department of Justice with it. I'm not familiar with the report.
I'm aware that some Israeli citizens have been detained. With respect to why they are being detained and the other aspects of your question, whether it's because they're in intelligence services or what they were doing, I will defer to the Department of Justice and the FBI to answer that.
Now, when the FBI investigated, it quickly unraveled to be the largest foreign spy ring ever uncovered inside the United States, the largest. Even the Soviet Union had not been spying on the United States as much as Israel has been doing. So the FBI started to round up these spies. They started to arrest them very quietly, and they were about halfway through this process of rounding up this spy ring when 9/11 happened.
Numerous classified documents obtained by Fox News indicate that even prior to September 11th, as many as 140 other Israelis had been detained or arrested in a secretive and sprawling investigation into suspected espionage by Israelis in the United States. Investigators from numerous government agencies are part of a working group that's been compiling evidence since the mid-90s. These documents detail hundreds of incidents in cities and towns across the country that investigators say, quote, may well be an organized intelligence gathering activity. The first part of the investigation focuses on Israelis who say they are art students from the University of Jerusalem and Bezalel Academy. Documents say they, quote, targeted and penetrated military bases, the DEA, FBI, and dozens of other government facilities, and even secret offices and unlisted private homes of law enforcement and intelligence personnel. The majority of those questioned, quote, stated they served in military intelligence, electronic surveillance intercept, and or explosive ordnance units.
What about this question of advanced knowledge of what was going to happen on 9/11? How clear are investigators that some Israeli agents may have known something?
Well, it's very explosive information, obviously, and there's a great deal of evidence that they say they have collected, none of it necessarily conclusive. It's more when they put it all together. A bigger question, they say, is how could they not have known? Almost a direct quote. Brett.
It is now apparent that this intelligence ring was inside the U.S., had prior knowledge of 9/11, and had a classified role in 9/11, which officials refused to discuss. It was also able to penetrate U.S. intelligence agencies and secret offices, yet all were released. The men who were detained due to the report they were taping the first plane crash and then celebrating and joking about it actually went on television and admitted it was their job to record the attack.
And at that point, we were taken for another round of questioning, this time related to our allegedly being members of Mossad. The fact of the matter is we are coming from a country that experiences terror daily. Our purpose was to document the event.
How could they have known about the attack? And who sent them to document it? The evidence points to a large intelligence network inside the United States that had teams on the ground, such as the ones recording the attack, and electronic surveillance teams gathering information.
America was attacked on September the 11th in circumstances which were absolutely suspicious. Who attacked America on September the 11th? And we have said that there is a massive cover-up on the part of the Bush administration. When we look at their strategy, we see that they put on board the aircraft a large number of Saudis. Sounds suspicious. Why so many Saudis? And these are not Saudis who are well known for their Islamic fervor, for being what they call militants. No, these are middle of the road, normal Saudis who drive BMWs. Why so many Saudis? It's suspicious. And why these middle-of-the-road Saudis? The answer is because there is something common between the state of Saudi Arabia and the state of Israel which would surprise you. They are sisters. The same forces who work for the establishment of the state of Israel are the same forces who work for the establishment of the state of Saudi Arabia. The same forces who have kept Israel alive today and guaranteed Israel's security are the same forces who have kept Saudi Arabia alive today and has guaranteed Saudi Arabia's security. And when the state of Israel is to be destroyed, Saudi Arabia also goes down into the garbage bin. They're sisters. A large number of those who are now fighting Assad in Syria are paid by the Saudis and the Qataris and are trained and have been given arms to go and invade another country. May Allah grant the day will come when Saudi Arabia will be invaded in the same way. Qatar and Saudi Arabia are Zionist countries. Oh yes. Allah says in the Quran, وَمَنْ يَتَوَلَّهُمْ مِنْكُمْ فَإِنَّهُ مِنْهُمْ. If you turn to them with friendship and alliance, you belong to them, says Allah, not to us. It's not just in Syria, of course. There's more oppression in Saudi Arabia. How many of them going to Saudi Arabia to liberate Saudi Arabia? How many? They'll never do that. They will never do that. Never, 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 never do that. What kind of jihad is that? They don't even think about that. Hijaz is the heart of Islam. The Hajj is today under Zionist control. That's worse than Assad anyway. How many of them are prepared to go to Saudi Arabia to wage jihad? None. How many will go to Qatar to liberate Qatar? None. How many will go to Turkey to liberate Turkey from NATO control? None. But you want to get rid of Assad.